My most terrifying night as a prison guard didn't happen during a riot. It wasn't caused by a shank in the back during lunchtime or a hostage situation in the warden's office. It happened in the dead silence of winter, and even now, years later, I still hear his screams. They don't fade. If anything, they get louder when the house is quiet, echoing in the hollow spaces of my memory like a recording that refuses to stop playing. People think they know what fear is. They think fear is a gun pointed at your face. But true fear isn't a weapon. True fear is the realization that the laws of reality you rely on have suddenly ceased to exist. It was late January in Montana. I was working the graveyard shift at Blackwood State Penitentiary, a monolithic slab of concrete and steel jutting out of the mountainside like an infected wound. We called the segregation unit the Tomb, and the name was well earned. It was underground, devoid of natural light, and smelled permanently of stale bleach, damp concrete, and human misery. Down there, time didn't move in hours. It moved in heartbeats and the rhythmic buzzing of the fluorescent lights. On that specific night, a blizzard of historic proportions was hammering the state. The meteorologists had called it a bomb cyclone, but from where I stood, watching the security monitors flicker with static, it looked like the end of the world. The wind howled against the upper levels of the prison with such ferocity that even 3 floors down in the tomb, I could feel the vibrations in the floor. It was a deep, resonant thrumming, like the belly of a starving beast. I was the senior officer on duty, accompanied only by a rookie named Miller. Miller was a good kid, barely 22, with a clean uniform and eyes that hadn't yet seen enough darkness to lose their shine. I sent him to the break room to check the coffee pot, preferring the solitude. I needed the quiet. I walked the central corridor, my boots clicking against the linoleum in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Click, clack, click, clack. It was the only sound in the world, or so I thought. My rounds brought me to cell 42. This was the holding pen for our newest and most disturbing resident, inmate 094, Elias Thorne. Thorne wasn't a large man. He didn't have the hulking physique of the gang enforcers or the tattooed skin of the career criminals. He was wiry, almost skeletal, with pale skin that looked like parchment stretched over bone. He had been transferred to us after a gruesome event in a farmhouse 3 counties over. The police report said he had slaughtered a family of 5. Thorne claimed he had just been there when it arrived. He never specified what it was, but the look in his eyes, a mixture of absolute terror and hollow resignation, made you want to believe him, even when logic told you he was a monster. I stopped in front of his cell. The thick plexiglass was scratched, but I could see him clearly. He wasn't sleeping. In the 3 weeks he had been at Blackwood, I wasn't sure I had ever seen him sleep. He was sitting in the center of his bunk, cross-legged, facing the wall. He was rocking back and forth, a subtle rhythmic motion that matched the swaying of the trees outside in the storm. I watched him for a moment, feeling a cold prickle of unease slide down my spine. It wasn't just his behavior, it was the atmosphere around him. The air near cell 42 always felt colder, heavier. It felt like standing next to a deep, dark drop-off. Suddenly, Thorne stopped rocking. He didn't turn around. He just froze, his spine stiffening. "It's here, Officer Reynolds," he whispered. I barely heard him through the glass, but the sound carried a strange clarity. I hadn't told him my name. We didn't wear name tags in segregation for safety reasons. "Go to sleep, Joe 94, I said, my voice sounding rougher than I intended. I tried to project authority, the weary indifference of a veteran guard, but my hand instinctively drifted toward the baton on my belt. "The storm didn't bring the snow," Thorne continued, his voice rising just an octave, trembling. "The snow is just the blanket. It's hiding underneath. It knows the lights are going to die." I scoffed, turning away to continue my patrol, dismissing it as the ramblings of a lunatic. But then, the lights flickered. It wasn't a normal flicker. It wasn't a loose bulb. The entire grid of the segregation unit surged, blindingly bright white for a split second, before plunging into a dim, brown-out state. The hum of the ventilation system died instantly, leaving a suffocating silence that pressed against my eardrums. "Miller!" I shouted down the hall, my voice echoing too loudly in the sudden quiet. "Check the breaker." There was no response, just the heavy, suffocating silence. Then the main power failed completely. Total darkness swallowed the corridor. For a few seconds, I was blind, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then, the emergency red floodlights kicked on, bathing the hallway in a bloody crimson wash. Shadows stretched and distorted, turning the familiar prison block into a twisted tunnel of hell. I reached for my radio to call Central Control, but all I got was a screech of high-pitched static that made me wince. And then I heard it. A mechanical clunk. It was the sound of a solenoid disengaging. Then another. Clunk. Clunk. My blood ran cold. In a modern prison, the doors are electronic. They are supposed to default to locked in a power outage, held by magnetic force. But Blackwood was old, and the retrofitting in the tomb had been done by the lowest bidder. I stared down the blood-red corridor and saw the heavy steel door of cell 42 drift open an inch. I froze, waiting for Thorn to burst out, waiting for the attack. But he didn't move. Instead, from the darkness of his open cell, a sound began to rise. It started as a low moan, a guttural vibration that seemed to come from the floor itself. Then it sharpened, rising in pitch, twisting into something that sounded like a man drowning in his own blood. It wasn't a scream of anger. It wasn't a battle cry. It was a scream of pure, unadulterated recognition, as if he was seeing something in the corner of his cell that terrified him more than the electric chair ever could. And then, from the other end of the hall, where the darkness was absolute, something answered him. The sound that answered Elias Thorn was not human. It was a wet, rattling gurgle, like air escaping a punctured lung, yet it carried a deliberate cadence. It mimicked the pitch of Thorn's scream perfectly, but stripped of all emotion, leaving behind only a hollow, mechanical mockery. It came from the far end of the corridor, near the intake elevator, the only way in or out of the tomb. My training kicked in before my brain could process the impossibility of the situation. In a riot, hesitation is a death sentence. I drew my baton, the heavy polycarbonate feeling slick in my sweating palm. The red emergency lights hummed overhead, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to detach themselves from the walls and crawl across the floor. The temperature had plummeted. I could see my breath pluming in the crimson air, freezing in jagged clouds. It wasn't just the blizzard outside. The cold down here felt unnatural, aggressive, biting through my uniform as if I were naked. I turned my attention to cell 42. The door was ajar, a gaping black mouth in the red wall. Thorn hadn't moved. He hadn't taken the opportunity to run, to attack, or to riot. He was pressed into the furthest corner of his cell, his knees drawn to his chest, his hands clamped over his ears so tightly his knuckles were white. He wasn't trying to get out. He was trying to disappear. "Stay down," I commanded, my voice sounding thin in the heavy air. "Do not move from that bunk." Thorn didn't acknowledge me. He was muttering something, a rapid-fire stream of words that I couldn't catch, his eyes fixed on the open doorway of his cell as if waiting for an executioner. I had to find Miller. The rookie was in the break room, situated halfway down the hall between the cells and the elevator. If the magnetic locks had failed on cell 42, they had likely failed everywhere. That meant I was potentially walking into a corridor filled with unlocked cells. But as I moved forward, sweeping my flashlight beam left and right, I realized the other doors were still shut. The failure was localized. Only Thorn's door had opened. It was as if the system had specifically invited him out. The silence returned, heavier than before. The rattling sound from the elevator had stopped, replaced by the oppressive sound of the wind howling far above us, muffled by tons of concrete. My boots squeaked on the floor, every step feeling like a thunderclap. I reached the break room. The door was open. "Miller," I hissed, keeping my back to the wall, flashlight raised. The beam cut through the darkness of the room. The coffee pot lay shattered on the floor, a dark puddle spreading across the tiles. The table was overturned. In the corner, illuminated by the strobe-like flickering of a dying emergency bulb, stood Miller. He was facing the wall. His posture was rigid, unnatural, like a mannequin forgotten in a warehouse. His arms hung limp at his sides. "Miller, report," I said, stepping into the room. The air here smelled strange, not like coffee, but like ozone and copper, like an electrical fire mixed with old pennies. Miller didn't turn. He didn't flinch. I reached out, grabbing his shoulder to spin him around. His uniform was freezing to the touch, stiff with cold. As I turned him, I braced myself for a wound, a slash across the throat, the work of an escaped prisoner. But Miller was physically unharmed. His face, however, was a mask of absolute vacancy. His eyes were wide open, pupils dilated so much that the irises were barely visible, swallowing the light of my flashlight. He was staring at something 1,000 miles away. "Miller, snap out of it," I shook him. "The comms are down. We need to manually secure cell 42. Thorn is loose." Miller's jaw worked, grinding teeth together. Then he spoke. "The snow isn't the blanket," he whispered. I froze. It was the exact same phrase Thorn had used minutes ago, but it wasn't Miller's voice. The timbre was wrong. It was deeper, raspier. It sounded like an old man's voice coming out of a 22-year-old's mouth. "What did you say?" I stepped back, my grip on the baton tightening until my hand cramped. Miller blinked, and for a second, the vacancy in his eyes cleared. He looked at me, confusion and terror flooding his expression. He gasped, clutching his chest as if he had just surfaced from drowning. "Sir!" Miller wheezed, his own voice returning, high and panicked. "Sir, The lights went out. I heard someone. In the hall. I thought it was you." "It wasn't me," I said grimly. "We need to move. Now." "I saw him, sir," Miller stammered, grabbing my arm. His grip was like iron. "I saw my father, standing in the doorway." My stomach twisted. I knew Miller's file. His father had died in a car wreck 10 years ago. "You're hallucinating. It's the stress and the gas leak or something," I lied, trying to rationalize the irrational. "Get it together." Before Miller could respond, the radio on my belt, which had been emitting nothing but static, suddenly crackled to life. But it wasn't central control. It wasn't a dispatcher asking for a status report. Through the speaker, clear as a bell amidst the static, came a sound that stopped my heart. It was the sound of a lullaby, a specific lullaby. "Hush, little baby. Don't say a word." I stared at the radio in horror. My mother used to sing that to me. She had been dead for 5 years. The voice humming the tune wasn't hers, though. It was a distorted, digital mimicry of her voice, layered over the sound of that wet, rattling gurgle I had heard earlier. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by a voice that sounded exactly like mine. "Come see what I found, Marcus. Come back to the cell." I looked at Miller. He was trembling, staring at my radio. The voice on the radio was mine, but I hadn't spoken. That was you, sir?" Miller whispered. "No," I said, the word tasting like ash. "That wasn't me." From down the hall, back towards cell 42, a loud slam echoed, metal on metal. Then, the sound of laughter. Not manic laughter, conversational laughter. The sound of a cocktail party happening in the middle of a dungeon. "We aren't alone down here," I whispered, "and whatever it is, it knows us." We left the break room, not because we wanted to, but because the room had begun to feel like a cage shrinking around us. The air was growing stale, thick with that metallic scent of ozone, and the lingering phantom smell of my mother's perfume that had drifted from the radio. I took the lead, flashlight beam cutting a shaky cone through the crimson haze of the emergency lights. Miller followed close behind, his breathing ragged and loud, sounding less like a trained officer and more like a frightened child, hyperventilating in the dark. The corridor seemed different now. It wasn't just the lighting. The architecture felt wrong, stretched. The distance between the break room and the cell block, a walk I had made 1,000 times, felt interminable. The shadows cast by the bars of the empty cells didn't stay put. They swayed on the walls, dancing to a rhythm I couldn't hear. The temperature had dropped further. Frost was now patterning the walls. intricate fractals of ice blooming on the painted concrete, writing a language I couldn't read. As we neared the sector housing Cell 42, the auditory hallucinations shifted. The conversational laughter I'd heard earlier, the sound of that impossible cocktail party, began to degrade. It slowed down, warping into a deep, grinding mechanical noise, like gears chewing on bone. Then, silence. Sudden, absolute silence that made my ears pop. "Stay close," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. "Don't look at the open cells, just eyes forward." Miller didn't answer, but I felt his hand grip the back of my utility belt. He was holding on for dear life. We reached Cell 42. The door was still ajar, just as I had seen it. I positioned myself against the frame, baton raised, and swung the flashlight beam inside. Elias Thorne was exactly where I had left him. He hadn't moved a muscle. He was pressed into the corner, his eyes squeezed shut, his lips moving in a silent, frantic prayer. But the cell wasn't empty. Scattered across the floor were photographs, dozens of them. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Thorne didn't have personal effects. He was high-risk segregation. No photos, no letters. But the floor was littered with Polaroids. I stepped closer, keeping the light trained on them. They weren't random photos. They were pictures of me. Me walking to my car. Me sleeping in my bed at home. Me sitting at the diner 3 towns over. And there were photos of Miller too. Miller at his graduation. Miller at his father's funeral. "Where did you get these?" I demanded, the fear in my chest transforming into a hot, panicked anger. "Thorne, look at me." Thorne's eyes snapped open. The terror in them was boundless, a bottomless well of despair. He looked at me, then his gaze darted past my shoulder, focusing on something in the darkness of the hallway behind me. "I didn't bring them," Thorne whispered, his voice dry as dead leaves. "It brought them, to show you it knows the way home." I spun around, shining the light back into the corridor. Nothing but red-washed emptiness and the swirling dust motes dancing in the beam. "What is it, Thorne?" I yelled, losing my composure. "Is there someone else in the block?" "It's not someone," Thorne hissed, leaning forward, his skeletal face illuminated by the spill of my light. "It's an echo. It eats sound and spits it back out with teeth. It takes your grief, Officer Reynolds. It wears your sins like a coat. It's hungry." Suddenly, Miller let go of my belt. I turned to look at him. The rookie was staring down the hall toward the intake elevator, the only exit. The heavy steel doors of the elevator shaft were vibrating. Thump, thump, thump. A rhythmic pounding from inside the shaft. "Dad?" Miller whispered. The word hung in the air, fragile and desperate. "Miller, don't," I warned, stepping toward him. "That is not your father. The elevator is dead. There's no power." "I can hear him," Miller said, tears streaming down his face, freezing on his cheeks. "He's hurt. He's calling me." "It's a trick," I shouted, grabbing his arm. But the sound changed. The thumping stopped, replaced by a voice screaming from behind the elevator doors. It was a man's voice, gargled and wet, pleading for help, screaming Miller's first name. "Davy! Davy, help me! It's so cold!" It was horrific. It sounded exactly like a man trapped in twisted metal, dying. It was the specific nightmare Miller lived with every day since the accident. Miller's face crumpled. He shoved me. He possessed the strength of hysterical adrenaline. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet on the slick floor, hitting the ground hard. My flashlight skittered away, spinning across the linoleum, the beam strobing wildly. "No! I'm coming!" Miller screamed, sprinting down the hall toward the elevator. "Miller, stop!" I scrambled to my feet, my knees popping, grabbing my dropped light. I ran after him, my boots slipping on the ice that now coated the floor. Miller reached the elevator doors. He began pounding on them, sobbing, begging his dead father to hold on. Then, the impossible happened. The heavy steel doors, which required hydraulic power to operate, slid open smoothly, silently. There was no elevator car. There was only the open shaft, a black throat plunging down into the bowels of the earth. Miller didn't stop. He didn't look down. He just stepped forward, reaching into the dark as if someone were standing there to catch him. "Davy, come here," the voice whispered from the abyss. "Miller!" I lunged, my fingers brushing the fabric of his uniform shirt. I missed. Miller stepped into the void, but he didn't fall. He was pulled. I saw it for a fraction of a second in the beam of my flashlight. Something pale, long, and many-jointed, like the limb of a spider made of human skin, shot up from the darkness of the shaft. It wrapped around Miller's waist with bruising force and yanked him down. There was no scream, just a sharp, wet crack as he disappeared into the dark. Then, the elevator doors slammed shut with a finality that shook the floorboards beneath my feet. I stood alone in the red-lit corridor, my chest heaving, my mind fracturing. The silence returned, instantaneous and total. And then, from behind the closed elevator doors, a voice spoke. It wasn't Miller. It wasn't his father. It was my voice. Perfect, calm, professional. "Officer down," the mimic said. "Officer down." Then, it began to laugh. The laughter behind the elevator doors died out, fading into a wet, rasping cough that sounded terrifyingly like Miller choking on his own blood. Then, silence reclaimed the corridor. I stood frozen, my weapon uselessly pointed at the steel doors. My brain was trying to reject what my eyes had just witnessed. The human mind has a safety mechanism, a circuit breaker that trips when reality violates the rules of physics. I had just seen a limb made of pale, impossible anatomy drag a grown man into a shaft that should have been empty. My training screamed at me to secure the scene, to call for backup, to initiate rescue protocol. But the primal part of my brain, the lizard brain that kept our ancestors alive in caves, screamed a different command. Hide. I didn't run. Running triggers a predator's chase instinct. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on the dark end of the hall, my boots sliding silently on the frost-slicked linoleum. I needed a wall at my back. I needed a perimeter. I retreated to the only place that made sense, the epicenter of this nightmare, cell 42. When I reached the doorway, I didn't hesitate. I stepped inside the small, cramped concrete box and manually slammed the heavy steel door shut. The lock didn't engage. The power was still out, but the weight of the door was enough to create a barrier. I jammed my baton through the handle loops, creating a makeshift deadbolt. I was now locked in a cage with a mass murderer. And for the first time in my career, the prisoner wasn't the threat. He was my only ally. Elias Thorne was still sitting in the corner, but he was no longer rocking. He looked up at me, his eyes clear, devoid of the panic that had gripped him earlier. Now that the monster had fed, the tension in the air had shifted. It wasn't gone. It was digesting. "You shouldn't have let him answer," Thorne said softly. His voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "It uses the ones you love to open the door. It wears their voices like a key." "Shut up," I snapped, though my voice lacked any real authority. I slumped against the cold door, sliding down until I hit the floor. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold my flashlight. "What is that thing, Thorne? You brought this here. You brought this hell to my prison." Thorne shook his head slowly. "I didn't bring it, officer. I'm just the pantry. It follows me because I see it. Most people, their minds edit it out. They see a shadow, a glitch in the light. But I see the teeth. And once you see the teeth, it knows you're watching." He pointed a bony finger at the photos scattered on the floor, the pictures of me, of Miller. "It studies us," Thorne whispered. "It learns the texture of our fear. That boy, Miller, he was full of grief. He was loud. Grief tastes like salt to it. You taste like regret." I wanted to hit him. I wanted to tell him to stop speaking in riddles. But outside the cell, the sounds began again. It started as a soft scraping against the concrete walls of the corridor. Scrape, drag, scrape, drag, like something heavy and wet pulling itself along the floor. It was moving away from the elevator. It was coming toward us. I clicked off my flashlight. Quiet. We sat in the absolute darkness of the cell, the only light coming from the faint, bloody glow of the emergency lights filtering through the small plexiglass window in the door. The red light cast a rectangular patch on the opposite wall. We watched that patch of light. A shadow moved across it. It wasn't the sharp, defined shadow of a person walking. It was amorphous, shifting, jagged. It paused in front of the door. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I held my breath, my hand gripping the baton jammed in the door handle. Then, a face pressed against the small plexiglass window. It was upside down. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. The face was pressed so hard against the glass that the features were flattened, pale and distorted. It was Miller's face, but the eyes were wrong. They were missing. In their place were two smooth patches of skin, like a doll that hadn't been finished. And the mouth. The mouth was open in a silent, stretched grin that was too wide, revealing too many teeth. The thing wearing Miller's face tapped on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. Then it spoke. But it didn't use Miller's voice. It used the voice of the warden. "Officer Reynolds, this is Warden Hayes. Open the door. We have the power back on. Open the door, son." The mimicry was perfect. The cadence, the gravelly authority, the slight southern drawl. If I hadn't been looking at the eyeless abomination through the glass, I would have opened it. "It's not real," Thorne whispered from the corner. "Don't listen to the cadence. Listen to the space between the words. It doesn't know how to breathe." He was right. The voice didn't pause for breath. It was a continuous stream of audio, stitched together. "Open the door. Marcus, open the door. Stop playing games. Report to duty. Immediately open the door." The voice began to speed up, overlapping with itself, glitching. It shifted from the warden to Miller, then to my own voice, then to a cacophony of random sounds. A dog barking, a woman crying, the sound of a car crash. I squeezed my eyes shut. "Go away," I roared. The tapping stopped. The face pulled away from the glass with a wet suction sound. For a long minute, there was silence. "Is it gone?" I whispered, sweat stinging my eyes. "No," Thorne said. "It's trying a different key." Suddenly, my radio, which I had turned off, clicked on. The volume was cranked to the maximum. Static hissed, loud and harsh. Then, a sound cut through the white noise that made my blood turn to ice. It was the sound of a piano, a clumsy, hesitant melody being played on an out-of-tune upright. I knew that song. I knew that piano. It was Für Elise, badly played. My breath hitched in my throat. "No." "Who is that?" Thorne asked, his voice tinged with genuine curiosity. "My daughter," I choked out. She died 3 years ago. Leukemia. She was learning that song. She never finished learning it. The music on the radio stopped mid-measure, just like it had the day she was too weak to lift her hands to the keys. Then, a small, frail voice came through the speaker. It was raspy, weak, filled with the confusion of a dying child. "Daddy, it's dark down here. Why did you leave me in the dark?" "It hurts, Daddy." Tears burst from my eyes, hot and uncontrollable. The guilt I had carried for 3 years. The guilt of being at work when she took her final breath, of not being there to hold her hand, slammed into me with the force of a freight train. It wasn't just a voice. It was her. It had her inflection, her nickname for me. "Daddy, please open the door. The cold man is hurting me." I reached for the baton, jamming the door. My logic was shattering. The rational part of my brain was screaming that this was a trap, but the father in me was screaming that my little girl was outside, alone, in the cold. "Don't!" Thorne lunged from the corner, grabbing my wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. "It's not her. It's just echoes. If you open that door, you don't save her. You feed it." "Let go of me," I shouted, struggling against him. "That's Sarah. She's scared." "She is dead," Thorne yelled, shaking me. "Look at the window, Reynolds. Look!" I looked up at the plexiglass. The face wasn't there anymore, but something else was. A hand was pressed against the glass, a small, delicate hand, the hand of a 7-year-old child. But as I watched, the fingers began to elongate. They stretched, growing extra joints, cracking and snapping as they lengthened into spindly, needle-like claws that scratched deeply into the reinforced glass. Scream! The sound of the claws on the glass merged with the voice on the radio. "Daddy, let me inside, or I'll have to break the glass." The radio voice dropped the child's pitch and deepened into a demonic, guttural growl that vibrated in my teeth. "I'm so hungry, Marcus." The glass began to crack. The spiderweb fracture in the plexiglass wasn't just a break in the material. It was a break in the dam holding back the impossible. As the crack spread with a sickening pop-hiss sound, the voice on the radio, the one mimicking my dead daughter, dissolved into a wall of screeching static. It was a sound so high and piercing that I felt blood trickle from my nose, warm and metallic against the freezing air. "We have to move," Thorne said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. He wasn't looking at the window anymore. He was looking at the ventilation grate in the ceiling of the cell. "The glass will hold for maybe 10 seconds. When it breaks, the pressure difference, it'll suck the air out, or let the cold in." I wiped the blood from my upper lip, my hand shaking. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my gut, but the adrenaline of survival had begun to pump through my veins, sharpening my senses. I looked at the heavy steel door, currently barred by my baton. "The shower block!" I gasped, my mind racing through the blueprints of the facility I had memorized a decade ago. "At the end of the east wing. There's a maintenance hatch behind the plumbing wall. It leads to the steam tunnels. It's the only way out that doesn't require an electronic keycard." "The east wing?" Thorne looked at me, his pale eyes wide. "That's past the elevator. That's past where it took the boy." "It's that or we die in this box," I said, grabbing my flashlight. "On my count, I'm pulling the baton. We run. We don't stop. If you hear a voice you know, you don't listen. If you see someone you love, you don't look. Do you understand?" Thorne nodded grimly. "Run." I gripped the baton. The face outside the glass had vanished, but the scratching sound remained, now joined by a heavy, rhythmic thudding against the steel, as if a battering ram were testing the hinges. 1, 2, 3. I yanked the baton free and kicked the door. It swung outward, screeching on its frozen hinges. We didn't wait to see what was on the other side. We burst into the corridor, sprinting into the red-washed nightmare. The hallway had changed. The frost on the walls had thickened into icicles that hung like stalactites, sharp and jagged. The floor was a sheet of black ice. We skidded, scrambling for traction, our breath tearing from our lungs in white clouds. We made it 10 yards before the smell hit us. It was the stench of a slaughterhouse mixed with the ozone of a lightning strike. "Keep moving!" I roared, shining my light ahead. As we passed the open shaft of the elevator, I made the mistake of looking. I couldn't help it. The beam of my light cut through the darkness of the pit. Down there, caught in the tangled cables and twisted metal of the elevator mechanism, was Miller. But it wasn't just a body. He was stretched. His torso had been torn open, and his ribs were splayed out like wings. And he was moving. Not under his own power, but like a puppet. Wires, no, tendrils of flesh, were woven into his limbs, jerking them in a grotesque parody of life. His head snapped up as my light hit him. The eyeless face grinned. "Officer on deck!" Miller's corpse shrieked, the voice booming up the shaft with the force of a foghorn. Then, something erupted from the shaft. It wasn't Miller. It was the thing controlling him. It scrambled onto the corridor floor with a speed that defied physics. In the strobe of the red emergency lights, I saw it. It was a pale, hulking mass of muscle and cartilage, translucent skin stretched over a frame that had too many joints. It moved on 6 limbs, some human, some insectoid. But the worst part was its back. Along its spine, embedded in the wet, glistening flesh, were faces. Faces of the people it had taken. I saw Miller's father. I saw a woman I didn't know. And in the center, pulsing like a tumor, was a face that looked uncomfortably like my own. "Don't look at it!" Thorn tackled me, shoving me forward just as a long, whip-like appendage slashed the air where my head had been. The claw sparked against the concrete wall, gouging a deep trench in the stone. We scrambled to our feet and ran. The creature let out a sound that was a mixture of a laugh and a sob, its many limbs clattering against the floor like a stampede of skeletal horses. "The showers! Left, left!" I screamed, drifting around the corner. The entrance to the shower block was ahead, a dark maw in the red wall. We dove inside, slipping on the tiled floor. The room was a labyrinth of waist-high concrete partitions and rusted showerheads. "The hatch! Where is it?" Thorn yelled, panic finally cracking his composure. "Back wall! Behind the last unit!" I scrambled over the partitions, my boots crunching on old soap and new ice. I reached the back wall. There, rusted and painted over a dozen times, was the access panel. It was a heavy steel square, bolted shut. "It's stuck!" I grunted, tearing at the handle. The paint had sealed it. From the entrance of the shower block, a shadow lengthened. The clattering stopped. The creature was here. It didn't rush us. It stalked. We could hear it breathing, a wet, rattling aspiration that sounded like water draining from a tub. "Marcus," it whispered. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "I can fix it. I can put the pieces back together. I can bring Sarah back. I have her song. I just need her daddy." "Help me!" I shouted to Thorn, kicking the panel. Thorn grabbed the handle with me. "Pull! On 3!" The creature stepped into the room. It was huge, scraping the ceiling. The faces on its back were all mouthing the words it spoke, a choir of the damned syncing with the monster's voice. It raised a limb, ending in a bone scythe, preparing to strike. "Pull!" We heaved with everything we had. The rust screamed, the paint cracked, and the panel gave way. It flew off, clattering loudly onto the tiles. Behind it was a dark, narrow tunnel, smelling of steam and rot. "Go!" I shoved Thorn into the hole. He scrambled in, disappearing into the dark. I turned to follow, but a cold, wet tentacle lashed out, wrapping around my ankle. I hit the floor hard, my chin slamming against the tile. The force of the pull was immense. I was being dragged backward, away from salvation, toward the waiting mouth of the abomination. I kicked wildly, my boot connecting with something soft that squelched. The creature shrieked, a sound of pure frequency that shattered the remaining light bulbs in the room, plunging us into total darkness. I was blind, I was being dragged, and I could feel the cold breath of the thing on my neck. "Shoot it!" Thorn's voice echoed from the tunnel. "I don't have a gun!" I screamed, clawing at the floor tiles, my fingernails tearing. "The steam pipe! Marcus, the valve above you!" I reached up blindly into the dark. My hand brushed hot metal. A pipe, a valve wheel. The creature hissed, its jaws opening near my ear. I could smell the decay in its throat. I grabbed the wheel and wrenched it with the last ounce of my strength. A jet of superheated steam exploded into the room with the sound of a jet engine. The creature roared in pain, its grip on my ankle loosening instantly as the scalding vapor blasted it. It wasn't built for heat, it was a creature of the cold. I scrambled backward, kicking free, and threw myself into the maintenance tunnel. "Close it!" I yelled. Thorn grabbed the steel panel from the floor and we slammed it back into the frame, holding it in place. From the other side there was a thud, then a scratch, then a scream of rage that vibrated the very fillings in my teeth. But we were in the walls now. We were in the veins of the prison. I slumped against the curved concrete of the tunnel, gasping for air, my ankle throbbing. "We aren't out yet," Thorn whispered, shining my dropped flashlight down the long, dripping pipe tunnel. "This leads to the boiler room. That's the heart of the building. That's where the heat comes from." "Good," It hates the heat." Thorn looked at me, his face a mask of grim realization. "No, Marcus, you don't understand. It doesn't just hate the heat, it's extinguishing it. That's why the power failed. It's not hunting us anymore. It's going to the boiler room to kill the fire. If it does that, the cold takes the whole mountain. And everyone inside, we weren't escaping. We were heading straight into the nest. The maintenance tunnel was a claustrophobic throat of concrete and rusted steel, sloping downward at a steep angle. The air grew heavier with every yard we scrambled, shifting from the biting, supernatural cold of the cell block to a thick, suffocating heat that tasted of iron and sulfur. It was a descent into the underworld, but for the first time that night, the heat felt like salvation. We burst out of the access hatch and tumbled onto the metal grating of the main boiler room. It was a cavernous space, the industrial heart of Blackwood Penitentiary. Dominating the room were three massive furnaces, roaring giants of cast iron and fire brick that vibrated with the force of the combustion inside. The noise was deafening, a constant, rhythmic thrum that shook the fillings in my teeth. The air shimmered with heat haze, distorting the catwalks and pipes above us like a mirage. "Check the pressure," I yelled to Thorn, pointing to the gauges on the central unit. "If the pressure drops, the safety cutoffs will kill the fire." "We can't let the fire die!" Thorn scrambled to the control panel, his movements jerky and frantic. He looked less like a man and more like a cornered animal. "It's holding!" he screamed back. "But the temperature is fluctuating! It's coming!" As if on cue, the heavy steel blast doors at the far end of the room, the main entrance for maintenance vehicles, began to groan. The metal buckled inward, the thick steel denting like aluminum foil. Frost began to bloom rapidly across the surface, spreading like a fast-forward video of mold consuming a piece of fruit. The intense heat of the boiler room fought against it, creating clouds of violently hissing steam where the two extremes met. Boom! The doors flew off their hinges, tumbling across the room and crushing a workbench flat. Through the swirling mist of steam and coal dust, the creature entered. In the full light of the furnace fire, it was a sight that defied sanity. It had shed the shadows that cloaked it in the corridors. It was a towering construct of pale, translucent flesh, woven together with the debris of its victims. I saw fragments of uniforms, shards of glass, and the frozen, screaming faces of the dead embedded in its chest like trophies in resin. It walked on four legs that bent the wrong way, its movements twitchy and glitching, as if reality itself was struggling to render its existence. The heat hit it immediately. The creature shrieked, a sound of digital feedback and human agony. Its skin began to blister and pop, black ichor oozing from the wounds and sizzling on the hot floor. "It burns, Marcus," the creature wailed, using my mother's voice again, but distorted, as if she were speaking underwater. "Why do you burn us? We only want to be together." "Feed the hopper," I roared at Thorn, grabbing a shovel from the wall. "Max output. Burn it out." I stood between the creature and the central furnace, brandishing the shovel like a spear. It was a pathetic weapon against a nightmare, but I had to buy Thorn time to overload the system. The creature lunged. It didn't run. It crossed the distance in a blur of motion, a flicker of broken time. A massive, clawed limb swiped at me. I ducked, feeling the wind of the blow ruffle my hair, and swung the shovel with all my strength. The metal blade connected with its side, sinking into soft, freezing flesh. It felt like hitting a bag of wet sand. The shovel stuck. The creature didn't even flinch. It backhanded me, sending me flying across the room. I hit the railing of the catwalk and collapsed, the breath driven from my lungs. Pain exploded in my ribs. I tasted copper. As I struggled to look up, I saw the creature ignoring me. It wasn't interested in the guard anymore. It was focused on Thorn. Thorn was standing by the open maw of the central furnace, the orange glow of the fire illuminating his skeletal frame. He wasn't shoveling coal. He was staring at the beast, a look of transcendent sorrow on his face. "It's not the cold," Thorn whispered, his voice carrying over the roar of the fire. "It's the emptiness. It needs to be filled." The creature stopped, towering over him. The faces on its chest writhed, mouthing Thorn's name. "Elias, Elias." "I know what you are," Thorn said, tears evaporating on his hot cheeks. "You aren't a monster. You're a grave, a mass grave looking for a headstone." "Thorn, Get away from it, I wheezed, trying to crawl upright. Thorn looked at me one last time. There was no fear in his eyes anymore, only the exhausted relief of a man who finally understands his purpose. The fire won't kill it, Officer Reynolds, Thorn said softly. It needs a vessel. It needs to be contained. It followed me because I'm the only one who can hold it. He turned back to the creature and opened his arms. Come on then, let's go home. The creature shrieked in triumph and lunged at him, wrapping its many limbs around his small body, absorbing him into its mass. At that exact moment, Thorn threw himself backward. He didn't jump away from the beast. He jumped into the open furnace door, taking the creature with him. There was no scream of pain. There was only a sudden, violent silence as they vanished into the inferno. Then, the boiler exploded. Not the metal casing, but the fire itself. A backdraft of unimaginable force roared out of the furnace mouth, a column of pure, white-hot purification. The shockwave slammed me against the back wall, and darkness finally took me. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Helena. The official report said there was a catastrophic gas leak in the heating system of Blackwood Penitentiary. They said the hallucinations were caused by carbon monoxide poisoning and hypothermia. They said Officer Miller died in the explosion, his body incinerated. They said inmate 094, Elias Thorn, was also lost in the blaze. They gave me a medal for bravery. They retired me with a full pension. They told me I was a hero, but heroes save people. I didn't save anyone. I live alone now, in a small cabin miles away from the snow line. I keep the thermostat at 80 degrees, summer and winter. I sleep with the lights on, but sometimes, late at night, when the house settles and the pipes in the walls begin to bang and rattle with the heat, I freeze. I sit up in bed, clutching my sheets, listening to the sounds of the plumbing. Most people hear water rushing. Most people hear the expansion of metal, but I know better. I know what the fire took, and I know that some things are too cold to ever truly burn. I listen to the pipes, and I don't hear water. I hear Elias Thorn screaming, and underneath his screams, I hear a lullaby, humming softly in the dark, waiting for the fire to go out. The silence of the snow hides many secrets, doesn't it? We leave Marcus Reynolds in his overheated cabin, forever listening to the pipes. But we know the truth. The cold always finds a way back. Some doors, once opened, can never be truly shut. If this descent into the frozen darkness of Blackwood Penitentiary sent shivers down your spine, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. You don't want to be left in the dark when the next story drops. I have a question for you. What is the sound that scares you the most in the dead of night? Is it the wind or something else? Let me know in the comments below and tell me where in the world you are listening from. I read every single whisper. More terrifying tales are already being written. Until then, keep the lights on.